Hello, here we are at part 2. We're going to go through chapters 5 through 8 of Mossflower, in which this time the Great Friendship begins. One of the great friendships in Redwall, which is Martin and Gaunt finally meeting one another. So that's kind of one of the great friendships in the series, and one of the most well known in the series if you are familiar with this. So, this is why this is a very significant part. We're going to encounter this friendship again in Legend of Luke some, and it's just foundational kind of to the overall narrative of the foundation of Redwall in being a key part in what will become Redwall later. So, here we are. This part does, though, include a lot of exposition. We do have some adventure stuff. We have Golf being captured, Golf and Martin being rescued, but other than that, we actually have a lot of important stuff that will actually become irrelevant later. Uh, so we have, first off, we have Gomp just mucking about as usual and not taking things very responsibly. But I like a lot of that description of the kind of joy that Gomp has as a character. There's a point where he's described is like kind of like the water and the gurgling of a stream nearby him that's spring to life is the same kind of gurgling spring that springs through all of Gomp's things, that he's just a joyous, bubbly character, and that's how he sees life. And that even is willing to, even in the midst of all this oppression and time in which he should be a little more careful about what he's doing, he takes time to lay back and pretend what it would be like to be a cloud. I love that detail, and it really just shows the joy Gomp has as a character, and kind of the somewhat stark, though not entirely. There is we're going to encounter Martin being joyous at times, but it stands in stark contrast at times to Martin's usually more head on shoulders, very serious attitude, and so we get that contrast real well here. And so it's and and so just even the way, of course, that he takes nothing seriously at all. This is in part, though, because he is smart. He is able to get out of difficult circumstances that he's gotten himself into, so he doesn't show very much concern. And we're going to see, though, later that he will have actual concern, that he will actually, like, really start to understand the seriousness and gravitas of certain events, and so he's not immune to that seriousness, but mainly it has to do with him. Like, he doesn't really care, in a sense, what happens to him, in a sense. He knows that personally he can get out of situations, and that he's just a little thief. What does the world matter to him in terms of what his life is worth, but in terms of how he values others' lives, it's way more important to him, and we're going to see that even more. We've seen that some with the way he takes care of Goody, Stickle, and the Hedgehog kids, but we're going to see that more. But all the little Gomp's comebacks and jokes when the Weasels and Stoats find him and capture him, jokes about even like eating himself, which is really funny, where like the chef, they're telling him the chef is gonna roast him, and he's like, oh yeah, save some for me, me for me, okay. Which is really really funny. Um, but again, we also get, of course, a lot in that section some of his joyousness by also continuing to put forth his ridiculous poems, which are all very delightful. And I do want to analyze maybe a little bit of them. And so, if we go to chapter 5, um, we're going to see how uh, uh, one of his more clever ones. I think this is a really clever one, where he says, "Cuckoo, good day, my friend, to you. O sly one, you know your best to lay in others' nest is a trick you often do, but I am smarter, sir, than you. Cuckoo, my friend, cuckoo." So it's very much what he's of course referring to is that the cuckoo bird lays its eggs in other birds' nests. And so I like the cleverness of that poem because he's saying, like, that's a clever trick, bird, but I'm cleverer. And that kind of speaks to just how kind of like cheeky and a bit like how he kind of has. I wouldn't quite call it ego. He doesn't have an ego because he doesn't really like take himself too seriously. But look, just like his kind of like I I'm I love besting everybody, and I'm even better than a cuckoo bird. That's how good I am at tricking you and tricking others. That I can even trick a cuckoo bird who performs this trick. And so that really speaks to Gom's character and is actually a very clever little rhyme. So I think that's one of his better ones so far. And we're going to look at one other in a minute here. But then, of course, he gets in trouble. The Quorum, which is the Council of Resistance in Mossflower, uh, they all basically in the end decide to rescue Gom because he actually is actually a help. He's not just, a guy who's just doing this for fun. He is actually helping. He may be a little scamp, and he may uh, not always be the smartest person who always has his head on tight, right, with his head in the clouds, but he actually does desire the goodness and benefit of others. So that, of course, they all desire to help him. And of course, we have our introduction here, especially to Skipper of Otters and Lady Amber, who are going to be the main resistance leaders in Mossflower throughout the rest of the book. It's going to be Skipper and Lady Amber. So this is our major. Um, we have a major introduction here. Amber was referred to and Skipper briefly in the previous one. I think no, it's this chapter, and so we have our first introduction to them. And so they're the main army leaders. We're gonna have to be watching carefully. I like so one of the things I also like is very much clearly that Brian um, is that Brian Jacques understands that there's still kind of a tension in the Mossflower Wood. They're not opposed to one another, and they all have similar goals, which is freeing Mossflower. But Skipper and Lady Amber are very different in personality. Skipper's way more laid back. He's way more jovial. He has a kind of like staunch kind of. He has a very staunch loyalty kind of attitude, and he's very much kind of that jovial, like, let's go get him kind of attitude. While Amber usually has a more serious, tactile way of approaching things, more analytical. Skipper is a bit more of a rusher, where he knows exactly what he thinks we should do morally. While Amber's much more willing to analyze the prospects of what needs to be done, and so they clash. And so Lady Amber often has a much more fierce attitude toward things, and so that's going to be a contention they'll have a few times throughout the book, and we'll get to that as well. We have then after Gaunt gets thrown in jail, we have him introduced to Martin, and we can see again that difference where Martin is still very much, he's like somber. He doesn't know how he's going to, of course, get out of this whole situation. He's been pretty much left to rot. He's getting weaker and weaker, but he still has that ferocity of spirit and desire to survive. So he hasn't given up, but he's very much in the worst place he can be. Well, Gomf, of course, is like, this is just every other day for me kind of attitude. And we see this in kind of when Corm gets the message to Gomf and Martin. Uh, Martin's way more skeptical, while Gomf is very much composed and really, and that's just in part due to the differences in personality and due to Gomf's very much willingness to kind of take everything and use it to his advantage. He's like a stick, right? Well, Gomf knows, of course, it's not a stick, but even that, he knows like how to manipulate things, and he takes. So when he's willing to be serious, which Gomf can be, he's very good at analyzing the situation. Martin is still very much weak on the exact details of things and wants to just do things and rush in to getting out and like getting out of here. And it's like Martin's like, Goff is like, let's take our time here. We gotta make for the right moment and all that sort of stuff. And it's here we also get Martin's backstory, at least some, where he was from the Northlands, where it was basically just fend for yourself and protect your own land, and he was given this responsibility by his father, who probably got it from his father, so they were living always on the edge, not sure when their last meal was coming from, versus the Mossflower, which always had plenty and was just taken over by a ferocious leader like Verdaga. And this is partially what I was talking about with Verdaga in the beginning, where Verdaga had a wise understanding of how to handle um, these Mossflowers. Put down resistance, don't let them take advantage of you, but I'm not going to also just oppress them to death, because that's not very helpful either. But Samina is basically like, just take whatever I can, when I can, whenever I can, and doesn't really have the mind to analyze like that. She has a very much, she and Martin actually, now that I think about it, have a very interesting kind of same personality, where they're very much driven characters. Despite her cowardice, she knows what she wants and wants to get at it, and so does Martin. Martin knows what he wants, and he's driven to get it and to do what is necessary to achieve it. But both sometimes have this ability to rush in headlong and not really think through everything clearly and precisely as they ought. Now, Martin's a bit more level-headed because he's not a complete, praised evil tyrant who killed his father. All right, right. So, but there is a kind of a similarity in contrast going on between Martin and Sarmina as well. And but we also so we get this kind of comparison and contrast where Mossflower had freedom, they had the ability to live their own lives. Well, Martin never really had that in a sense. Yes, he was still free and he could rule, but it was always on a um, knife's edge of death or life for them. And and he left when it became clear that it wasn't gonna help anything for him to stay, and there was nothing to stay for. His dad was gone. He was the only one really left, and he didn't have a family, so he opted to leave. Now, if you know a future book, which I've already brought up, I think in the series, Martin the Warrior, you're going to know that he's going to leave. He has left out something. There will be a bit of retconning to this story because it basically makes it sound like, oh, I left my home and I came directly southward, which we will learn is not entirely true, but it makes a lot of sense here, even if you haven't read Martin the Warrior, where you do get the sense that Martin is not entirely willing to disclose everything in his life. He gives enough to where you can see where his story is and what he's doing, and why, but he also is willing to, it seems also very much a character willing to keep things close to the vest, especially his more deeper, intense feelings about things. He has intensity of feeling that expresses it through the face, just by his nature of being this tough mouse, but not willing to openly share that. So we have that. And we also have more insight. We'll jump a bit ahead here, but since we're talking about Mossflower, we get some more insight with Bella Brockhall when she discloses to Germaine her life story, how she became kind of the head of this whole movement because of the death of her uh, husband, and because Boar the Fighter, who was the leader of Mossflower at the time, went off wandering, and so did her son, and we don't even know, she doesn't even know what happened to her son, and so she's been kind of left in charge as Verdaga has just taken over and oppressed, and she's kind of just been this one beacon for hope in Mossflower, while very much kind of lost in what to do herself. And thankfully she has others around her like Skipper and Amber, but it's still very hard for her, and so they're slowly rebuilding to the point where they can have this resistance. And so Skipper and Amber go off to get Martin and Gomf. In the meantime, they accidentally come across this group of mice from an abbey called Loamhedge, which had been plagued by this major disease. We're not given full details. This will become more important in a later book. There will be a later book that does actually address some of the stuff in with Loamhedge. That's actually really good, but we won't get into that now. So, but apparently Bella knew her when she had gone wandering in her younger days, and so the disease has brought them northward toward Mossflower, and she re-encounters Bella, and so we're beginning to see maybe a hint, right, of Redwall coming to fruition as well with an Abbey mice. So this is the first hint of Abbey mice, And this will be, again, somewhat plays in stark contrast to what we read in Redwall with the that Martin was found by the Abbey Mice. Well, the Abbey Mice just got here, right around the time Martin does, and there is no Redwall. So this is definitely one of um, Brian Jacques' retcons with Mossflower, where we clearly see that things are not quite the way they were described in Redwall. And I don't mind it here, mainly for a couple reasons. One, it's been hundreds of years, and that was kind of a summary thing. It doesn't go into detail. It's um, there to kind of give a backstory, and for Mortimer to basically say, Martin gave up his warriorness eventually and became this Abbey mouse, um, and stuff. So it's a summary thing, and some of that stuff may have been lost to time in the details. So this is just all they know. So I'm not really picky on some of that stuff. It kind of depends on what we're never told how much they actually know and whether that's summary. So I've never found that difficult to reconcile in my mind. Um, but they, but Lady Amber and Skipper go off to get Gomf, even though they don't know Martin is with them. And this leads to a wonderful chase scene between Fortunata, uh, Ashleg, and then Martin versus Gomf, and them running through the passages. I love my favorite bit, of course, is when Gomf ties Ashleg's cloak underneath the bed and then rushes out, stabbing Ashleg in the foot, and then running out. That's a really great scene. Bring the whole thing crashing and then sit in the air from the fireplace. That's all very dramatically wonderful and really works. Um, but yeah, and then of course, we had Gomf, of course, again showing his competence with the way he had gotten him out initially with the lock and the wire and the cheese, which I actually really like. That the cheese is not just food, but was used to open the lock as a greasing way to open the lock. That's really clever. I really like that. Um, oh, and I did want to talk about the the silly poem that Gump has, where he's where is that silly poem? I'm trying to remember. Um, uh, I knew a mouse in prison here more than 100 years. His whiskers grew along the ground and right back to his ears. His eyes grew dim, his teeth fell out, his silver hair went gray. If my granddad were here, I wonder what he'd say. Uh, I love that poem just because, like, it again shows just how much Gomf it is very good at creating silly little poems, and actually the cleverness of that poem, one being that it's that there's a grandfather to 100-year-old mouse, as Martin rightly points out, but also there's one other element, which is that the implication being that the mouse who's grown old and gray is him, and so he's making fun of the fact I might be here forever, even though he knows he's going to get out almost immediately. But again, Martin and Gomp manage to escape out, cleverly escape out, and jump through the window onto the yew tree. Um, yew tree, and this is an important place to point out our most significant event for this character, and he'll have a big event later, an important event later. But uh, are in these chapters we're introduced to Aguilar, who is the giant golden eagle. And I've always loved Aguilar. I love this idea of just this old, lazed uh, giant giant eagle, because it's kind of like he could be considered fast and fierce, and he shows his prowess throughout the book, but he's also kind of like way past his prime, and he's like, I really just don't care. Just whatever will luckily come my way, I'll deal with. But I also love taunting and just enjoying the last years of my life. Just whatever plump little food comes my way, I'll take what I can, but I'm not really in a rush. I get to enjoy nice warm weather here in Mossflower, and that's it. And I really like Argular. It's just kind of this very kind of like the most like laid back character in the entire book series. His only dream is for a pine marten. That's it. To eat a pine marten, and that's just really delightful and fun. And so he has this moment here where he snatches the stoat going after Martin Gaunt, and yeah, and that does not end well. And that's kind of like our first really gruesome death of this book. Um, and so, yeah, that doesn't end well for the stoat. Um, uh, Skipper and Amber manage to make a diversion and get Martin out, and the squirrels are too fast and too uh, clever for the uh, Sarmina's army, so they just disappear with Martin and Gonf in a minute. And so there we are. But Sarmina's still after them in hot pursuit, hoping to cut them off in their escape. We'll see if that works out for her. Um, what else? Is there something else I wanted to talk about? No, I think that's it. Um, um, Again, I love, um, yeah, and just the whiny. I love the whininess attitude of just again Fortunata and Ashleg trying to bumble their way around, trying to get to Martin Golf in that when they escape, and Sarmina's just frustrated. She just doesn't know what to do. The dynamic between all three of those is really good. Where you have this slightly sarcastic but very much frightful vixen, Sarmina's brash, angry attitude, and Ashleg's very cowering, whiny attitude about basically everything, and pretending like he's some great advisor, which he isn't. Not really. He's really not that wise or smart. Again, kind of shows that Verdaga was the only one who really kept things together, and how badly things have been run since Sarmina took over, and that Verdaga, for all his faults, has now this situation is beyond what the Woodlanders can take or deal with. And so this makes Mossflower in one of the bit more complicated books, and we're going to see a bit more complication with the way Skipper and Amber also go about doing things and stuff, and it's going to be very kind of edgy, I think, for the series as a whole. Um, Not super, but I think that there's going to be points where you're going to go like, wow, that's really the solution you came up with, Brian Jacques. And so it really shows that how desperate the Mossflower residents have become, and how much its leaders are willing to push the limits of what it takes to free Mossflower. Uh, so we're going to see more of that. Uh, Anything else? I think that's it. Alright, so chapters 5 through 8, the beginning, the meeting of the Great Friendship. And I guess I'll talk about that more in detail. I guess that's the one thing I really didn't talk about in terms of their actual meeting, where you see Martin. This is the first time we really get a sense of Martin starting to loosen up. I mentioned that he's still very reserved, but we see him beginning to loosen up because uh, Gomph is just so likable. He's so willingness to make friends with anyone, and he's ready and willing to be the able paw and to be an encourager as well. That's kind of Gom's real thing. It's not that he's a clever little thief; it's that he's an encourager, and that he brings hope to the Woodlanders, and then he brings hope to Martin, and so that hope to Martin is really what's going to drive Martin to look beyond himself and decide to be a part of this resistance, um, and to be a part of the movement. We're going to see that as the chapters progress, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that it's really Gomph in the first moves he makes to just lighten Martin's spirits that really form the basis of this friendship, even while Martin is still slightly reserved and still holding back a little. We're going to see him lighten up more and more as the series goes on, but he's still going to have to deal with the the, the tragedy of what happened to him in his life, and he's going to wrestle with those two things and and how it finally gets reconciled in the end. So there we are. I think that's it. So next time, next several chapters of Mossflower, and we'll be getting into the plans of resistance and how they start to slowly build and build on each other, and it's uh, the rescuing of Martin will prompt there to be an amp to this war, and so there we go. Bye.